Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Jacks. I'm a user experience design major and a religious and theological studies minor. I know, it's a very interesting combination. To give a quick overview of what I'll be discussing today, change slide, we're going to be going over the context of my research, which includes the purpose of the research, of course, research questions, and a very, very, very brief lit review. And we'll also be going over methodology, the data and my analysis, and of course, a brief conclusion. All right, on to the basics. What am I doing here? I imagine a lot of y'all probably don't know what user experience design is. User experience is more or less any interaction with a physical or digital space. UX designers focus on making these experiences user-centered and accessible so that engagement is as seamless as possible. Good UX tends to go unseen, but bad UX is very noticeable and very annoying for everyone to deal with. UX design is a rapidly growing field, primarily focused on digital products, and they're found in many industries. However, there's a lack of discussion and data about their presence within the religious industry specifically. So my research is aimed to analyze a small subset of the church website landscape in order to gain some cursory insight into the state of UX in religion and bring awareness to any possible industries or issues within these industries. So my research questions are as follows. What UX trends do church websites follow, especially related to accessibility? Do church websites have any field-specific trends? And lastly, do the trends found within church websites meet the goals of UX and the perceived goals of the churches? All right, so very brief lit review. In order to know where to go with my analysis, I needed to determine the situation. So according to WebAIM, a leading expert in web accessibility, 96% of the top 1 million homepages have basic accessibility errors. This is not a small number, as you can probably tell. This is also compounded by looking at who classifies as a church website user. The Pew Research Center and US Census Bureau explain that the older you are, the more likely you are to be both Christian and also to be disabled. Meanwhile, the younger you are, you're more likely to be unaffiliated, but you're also more likely to look for a church website online. Therefore, we have a little bit of a double-edged sword here. Accessibility is needed both to accommodate older people's higher disability rates, as they might be more likely to use these church websites, but we also need to be able to attract new members and or youths in order to grow our churches. There are some further reasons for why accessibility in church websites is important. First off, UX and Christianity do share common principles of empathy and inclusivity, so to include accessibility in a church website is a natural step in logic. Also, with increased internet usage, that means lost revenue if websites are inaccessible. Churches are businesses like any other, so it's important that they're able to earn revenue. All right, on to methodology. So in order to answer these research questions, I chose to perform a site audit for 3 church websites looking solely at a single denomination of churches based here in Austin. After some deliberation, I chose to look at Lutheran churches. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America included physical accessibility options like wheelchair access and assisted hearing devices in their search filters. So I thought it would be promising to look at digital accessibility if they already were inclined toward physical accessibility. In addition, I wanted to analyze the websites of a small, medium, and large church in order to get a better sense of the trends across the board. If I look solely at one size, trends may be skewed in one direction or another. I ended up using Gary McIntosh's metrics of church size in order to decide what was a big church and what was a small church and so on. So that is 200 or less worshipers for a small church, 201 to 400 for a medium, and over 400 for a large church. Now, there are some limitations to my analysis. First, it's very, very small in scope, in sample size, in the region I'm analyzing, and across denomination. A larger study would be able to analyze more churches across the US and across multiple denominations and be more holistic. Secondly, I'll only be able to properly audit the home pages of each church. While a homepage is a good cursory look into a website, it's not as holistic, but trying to audit an entire website would be very out of scope. Some of these websites are like hundreds of pages that I do not have time for that. All right. So in the end, I chose the Triumphant Love Lutheran Church as my large church, the First English Lutheran Church as my medium church, and the Holy Cross Lutheran Church as my small church. I will be referring to these solely by their acronyms because I do not have the time to say them all every single time I want to say them, which will be a lot. So TLLC, FELC, and HCLC. So you know what I'm talking about. All right, data analysis. We have very basic info that we're going to be looking at, looking more specifically at UX trends, and then looking more specifically at church trends. All right, on to the basics. So while it is difficult to determine like entire website size, it is very likely that the TLLC is larger than FELC, which is larger than HCLC, which makes sense given the sizes of the churches themselves. All three sites use WordPress, which I found very interesting, to build their sites. And, oh, sorry. Where was I? Right. And then the larger the site, they tend to use more third-party technology like plugins and like reCAPTCHA and Google like online store functions and all those sorts of things. And in addition, larger sites tend to have more content on each page. Sounds pretty standard to me, though it is interesting to note that site size is not correlated with average page load times. So that's interesting. So it's not necessarily content in terms of amount that leads to high load times. As for other things, smaller sites may have more unique content than larger ones, which may have more repeat content. Though in the case of church websites, it's a little bit tricky to tell the specifics because if a church website has a lot of scripture on their site, let's say, then they would likely have more repeat content than other industry websites. All right, UX trends. So we start off with Lighthouse and Page Speed Insights. These are both auditing tools which both measure a site based on performance, accessibility, best practices, and SEO, or search engine optimization. Basically, where does it show up when you search for it? I was able to perform these tests actually for every Lutheran church listed in the Austin area. So we're going to be looking at the full-scale results. It's very tiny. Apologies about that. As for specific trends, so it is the case that, if you go to the next slide, across the board, SEO scores fare better than accessibility and best practices, with large churches somehow having worse SEO, which I found interesting. Across the site, scores are generally consistent, so if one website has a certain score for accessibility, it will be the same across desktop and mobile. But this is different in performance, in which case desktop fares notably better than mobile performance. Otherwise, there does not seem to be a clear pattern across church size as to their metrics. So it's not the case that like large churches perform better than small churches, at least at this scale. All right, on to technical things. So breakpoints are basically something that computers and devices use to determine how the website layout should appear to you based on the size of your screen. So in the case of testing them, all three sites have issues at the laptop to tablet breakpoint, which results in some pretty wonky image sizing, as you can see there. Those images are not sized properly, and this shows up at particularly smaller breakpoints like mobile and tablet, not so much for the computer sizes. As for HTML and CSS, these two things dictate how a site works, more or less. HTML is the code structure of a website, while CSS dictates how the website looks to you. Otherwise, it would just be walls of text with no stylistic choices. All three sites have warnings, which means that their code is not quite up to par. As for SEO, all three have lackluster keyword distribution and are missing SEO tags and descriptions, which means that a user who may be trying to find this site may not be able to find it as easily if these things were all in a line. As for browser issues, FELC has problems with iOS under 17 and Android, while the HCLC has problems with iOS under 17 and most web browsers. So, yeah. All right, on to accessibility, which is the main focus That's my whole focus in UX, so that's what I focused on here. All right. Basics of accessibility. Some common things. All 3 sites have a main nav in the header. That is the lineup at the top with drop-down menus sometimes that you can go to different subsections of the website. All 3 have descriptive title tags. A title tag is basically, if you hover over the tab at the very top, what does it say in that tab? So all of those are pretty descriptive. So if you're on the home page of TLLC in this instance, it would say something like, Home, Triumphant Love Lutheran Church. Pretty descriptive. All 3 have human-readable URLs, which means it's not like YouTube where it's a string of letters and numbers and you can't know what the video is until you click on it. So, yeah. And then as for the image carousels, only TLLC has an image carousel, which depicted here is the Maundy Thursday, April 17th, but there's little arrows at the side where you can go to a different image and different set of text. These are a very common feature, but they're very inaccessible. So it's good to notice them when you do, because it means that if you're, say, low vision and you're relying on a screen reader, you may not be able to navigate this as well as a normal sighted person. All right, color contrast. This is very important. If there's not enough color contrast, you can't see it. The older you are, it's more likely you're going to need increased contrast because your eyes are probably not as good as they used to. Sorry to everybody who wears glasses. Yeah, so all 3 have low contrast text over images. You can see this in the Warship and Learning, or maybe you can't. It's very far away. Sorry about that. Where the white text very, very much blends into the background images, and you can't really read it. All right, alt text for images. Alt text is basically what a screen reader uses to determine what an image is, because you can't see it. So, like, if there was a picture of a dog, the alt text would probably say a picture of a dog or something like that. All 3 sites have images with missing or poor alt text, which means that a screen reader either doesn't see the image or it doesn't know what it means. All right, links. All 3 websites have redundant, empty, or broken links. A redundant link is just 2 links that lead to the same place that are really close to each other. All 3 also have non-descriptive, duplicate, or missing link text. In the case of what's here, there's a read more and continue reading, which out of context, you wouldn't know what that means. All right, here is a page with better descriptive links. As you can see, you can read all these and you have a general idea of where they lead to. Fun stuff. Hierarchy. This does not appear naturally to humans. This is more for the HTML. All 3 have improperly ordered heading types. So heading types are important because it determines what the screen reader reads in what order. If, say, an H3 tag is before an H2 tag, it'll read the H2 before the H3, even though visually it might be the other way around. So it's important to note also that heading sizes do not equal, like, this visual style of them can appear different. So. All right, church trends. I think we're low on time, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Descriptive navigation. So this is more like the link descriptions where it's like, can you read it? The HCLC lacks a descriptive nav. It also lacks some nav options that should be there. There are links on the home page that should be in the nav but aren't. Felk is also somewhat vague in their descriptive navigation. Triumphant Love Lutheran Church is pretty good though. So. Logo and brand consistency. First off, Felk has no logo. It's a bit interesting. You think it would. All 3 websites, though, have consistent website design, which is to say that each page more or less looks similar to one another, but it's important to note that none of them actually have a defined brand. So that is to say, if you exchanged out the content for a different site's content, would it still read as that particular business? In this case, no, it would not. Triumphant Love Lutheran Church is the closest because they use lots of elements from their logo, but even then it's only a loose brand. All right, value proposition and call to action. Value proposition is basically a business telling you why you should use them, and call to action is pretty straightforward. It calls you to do something like donate or visit a link or something. All three lack a value proposition and a proper call to action. All right. Social proof and lead generation. Social proof is like a testimonial. All three sites lack this, though in this case it kind of makes sense because these are churches and they're not selling a product. As for lead generation, which is basically like signing up for an email address or like a newsletter, sites vary. TLLC has one, Felk kind of has one, but it's out of the way, and then Holy Cross Lutheran Church doesn't even have an email address, so unfortunate. All right, location, service times, and contact info. If you are a visitor to a church website, it is likely that these are going to be what you're looking for on the website. TLLC has all of these things pretty front and center. They have a very clear presence, as you can see at the bottom there, and there are links to more details, which is nice. Felk, the other two are on the next slide. Felk has, can you go back a slide, sorry. Felk has these things on their homepage, but they're off to the side and they don't stand out texture or visually, so they're not as easy to see. As for HCLC, they're at the very bottom of the homepage, or not there at all, and they're very easy to miss. They blend in even more. And yeah, HCLC is very well. Yeah. All right, conclusion. All right, so what have we learned here? Turns out that both manual and technical analysis are important when auditing a website. There are things that computers can detect, and there are things that humans can detect, and they don't always line up, so it's important to have both viewpoints. As for the final question of do these trends meet the goals of the websites? There are many common accessibility errors. That makes sense, going back to the 96% of top million homepages having these errors. So it's not surprising, though it is unfortunate. As businesses, churches need people to use their services. If they don't have value propositions or call to action, then a user may not stay around as much. As an evangelical Lutheran church whose goal is to spread their message, they're not really doing so by not having ways to get users engaged with their site. And as phones are very widespread, them having issues with like performance and breakpoints and all these other things mean that these need further support and addressing. Overall, there's still a whole lot more to be learned. I barely touched the surface. There's a lot of bullet point fast information, but I hope you learned something new. So, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We have time for maybe one or two questions.
Did you find that the size of the church staffs play a role in the quality of the websites?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Did you find anything or look at the size of the staffs that are supporting these websites to determine, if the larger staffs actually equated to a more accessible website?
That is interesting. No, I did not directly look at that, though we did theorize about it a bit. A church with larger staff may have more support for these sorts of things, while a smaller church may not have any specific staff dedicated to it, or they may have just a member of the congregation who happens to know how to build a website, and so they rely on that member of the congregation. So quality can differ widely among churches.
Sarah, this is really fascinating. Thank you so much. So I'm curious, would you think maybe a next step might be to conduct interviews with maybe administrators of different churches to find out how much they're able to allocate for these kinds of resources and to think about issues like accessibility? I think you really touched on it in your response to the last question in terms of thinking about, are people just trying to work with volunteers? Are they not aware of all of these issues? Do they have anyone who's actively troubleshooting for them when it comes to social media or user X?
Yeah, I would love to do more research on that. One thing that was very hard to find was official research on this field, because religion already doesn't have a lot of research about tech in general, and so looking at church websites specifically, there's a lot that I simply don't know because it's not out there. So being able to get that direct qualitative information would be very beneficial in figuring out what the issues are on the ground and what actual users need for the websites.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop there.
Larsa to say a few words about Sierra.
Okay, I'm just gonna stand here.
So Sarah, what am I going to do without next year? No other students reliably drop into Discord or for my informal sessions or office hours like you do. You always ask great questions. I especially appreciate how you make connections across your different interests. This research being obvious to that, right? Religious studies with UX and that focus on accessibility. I want to thank you for the lessons you taught me, especially during our study abroad trip to London, that ATM is not necessarily a cash machine, but it means at this moment. And that you helped me to also slow down and enjoy the ravens and the squirrels. I'm in awe of your superpowers of keen observation. You're always aware of details that most people skip over, which makes you an amazing quality assurance tester and copy editor. You meticulously document inconsistencies in things like color usage, text formatting, and header sizes that other people miss. And I can't wait to see what you do next. Congrats.
There's that. Part one. Part two. Congratulations.